The boy was 12 years old when he knelt on the splintered floorboards of the abandoned farmhouse, his small body racked with sobs that seemed to come from the very earth beneath him. His hands, scraped raw and caked with dirt from hours of determined digging, rested on the cold, rusted metal of an iron box. He had pulled it from a cage of thick, ancient roots belonging to the massive Texas live oak that had defiantly grown through the center of the living room, its branches reaching for a sky it could only see through a collapsed roof. For 4 long years, every tear Joaquin David Salazar had shed was born of loneliness, of a deep and hollow despair that had become his constant companion. But these tears were different. They were not of sorrow, but of a revelation so profound and earth-shattering that it felt like the ground itself was shifting, remaking the world and his place within it. He was no longer just an orphan in a forgotten ruin. He was the keeper of a buried truth. This is a story about the strength found in forgotten places and the legacies that refuse to die. If you believe that a person's worth can never truly be erased, I invite you to become part of our community by subscribing to the channel and leaving a like to help this story reach others. We would love to know where you are listening from today, so please let us know in the comments below. The journey that led to this moment is a testament to the idea that even when the world tells you that you are worthless, a hidden truth may be waiting to prove it wrong, and it's a journey worth hearing until the very end. But to understand why this rusted iron box, unearthed from the roots of a tree, held the power to shatter and then rebuild a boy who believed he had been left with nothing, we must go back 3 weeks. We must return to the cold, disciplined walls of the Corazon de Maria orphanage in San Antonio to a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. It was on that day that a letter arrived, an official-looking envelope addressed to a name that was rarely spoken with any importance. It was a letter that the orphanage's director would read with a sneer, deem utterly worthless, and toss into the trash, never imagining that he was throwing away the key to a boy's entire history and future. Joaquin David Salazar was a boy made of silence and sharp angles, all knees and elbows held together by a quiet resilience that was tested daily. At 12 years old, his existence was measured not in years, but in the 4 winters that had passed since his grandmother Eleanor had been laid to rest, taking with her the only warmth he had ever known. Now his home was the Corazon de Maria orphanage, a place where the air itself seemed thin and grey, smelling perpetually of disinfectant and boiled cabbage. He moved through its hallways like a ghost, his shoulders slightly stooped, as if carrying the weight of an invisibility that had been forced upon him. His dark eyes, the same eyes he saw in the one faded photograph he owned, rarely met anyone else's, fixed instead on the scuffed linoleum floors, mapping out the geography of his confinement, while his mind drifted to memories of a life that felt more like a dream than a reality. The architect of this bleak world was Mr. Theodore Ashworth, the orphanage director. He was a man in his late 50s whose severity was etched into the tight line of his mouth and the cold, assessing gaze he cast upon the children. Ashworth did not see young souls in need of guidance. He saw a ledger of expenses and potential income. He spoke of discipline and utility, his words clipping the air with precision, instilling in the predominantly Mexican-American children a profound sense of their own inadequacy. To him, they were not individuals with histories and hopes, but a labor pool, a collection of assets to be managed. Joaquin learned early on that the surest way to navigate his days was to become as unnoticeable as possible, to shrink himself down until he was just another shadow on the wall, beneath the notice of a man who measured worth in dollars and cents. Each day was a perfect, suffocating replica of the last. The jarring clang of a brass bell at 5:30 in the morning was the starting gun for a race no one wanted to run. Breakfast was a bowl of thin, watery oatmeal, eaten in a cavernous dining hall, where the clatter of spoons against ceramic was the only permitted conversation. This was followed by rote lessons in a classroom where the Texas heat pressed in through the tall, grimy windows, making the air thick and hard to breathe. The words of the teacher droned on, but for Joaquin the lessons were meaningless. He had already learned the only truth that seemed to matter within these walls. He was an inconvenience, a problem to be managed until he was old enough to be released into a world that had no place for him. The afternoons were the worst part of the cycle. This was when Mr. Ashworth would loan out the older boys to local farmers and ranchers. Joaquin's small, wiry frame was put to work under the brutal afternoon sun, his hands growing calloused from mending fences, clearing rocks from fields, or hauling feed. He felt the sun beat down on the back of his neck, sweat stinging his eyes, his muscles aching with a fatigue that went bone deep. He knew that the pittance paid for his labor went directly into Ashworth's office, a transaction that stripped him of more than just his energy. It reinforced the director's core message. Joaquin's body was a tool to be used by others, his efforts belonging to someone else, his own life not truly his to live. The exhaustion he felt returning to the orphanage each evening was both physical and spiritual. The source of his deepest pain was not the labor or the meager food, but the story he was told about himself, a story he had started to believe. He was a boy without roots. His father, an American soldier he'd never met, was a name in a file, killed in a war in a distant land. His mother, a woman whose face he knew only from a photograph, had been lost to the very act of giving him life. With his grandmother gone, he was adrift, a loose thread in the fabric of the world. Ashworth's dismissive tone and cruel remarks were merely the confirmation of what Joaquin suspected in his heart. He was an accident, a leftover, a boy who belonged nowhere and to no one. This belief settled deep inside him, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of his stomach. His only defiance against this crushing narrative was a small, rectangular piece of cardboard kept hidden beneath the loose floorboard under his cot. It was a photograph of his mother, her smile soft, and her eyes full of a light he couldn't remember, but felt he knew. The edges were frayed, the colors faded to muted sepia tones from years of being held by his grandmother, and then by him. In the silent darkness of the dormitory, long after the other boy's breathing had evened out into sleep, he would pull it out. He would trace the outline of her face with his fingertip, whispering the name Elena had taught him, Marisol. This small, secret ritual was his anchor. It was the only proof he had that he was not simply a product of circumstance, but the continuation of a person who was loved. During the long, grueling hours in the fields, his mind would often escape the oppressive heat by retreating into the memories of his grandmother. He could almost hear Elena's voice, low and melodic, teaching him the names of the wild herbs that grew in the cracks of the sidewalk, or the way to tell direction from the sun's slow arc across the sky. She had taught him that the land had a language, that it offered sustenance and guidance to those who knew how to listen. These lessons, dismissed as folk nonsense by the orphanage staff, were a private inheritance. They were skills that felt useless within the disciplined walls of Corazon de Maria, but they were his, a legacy of knowledge passed down from the only person who had ever made him feel like he was part of a story worth telling. This sense of isolation was magnified by the atmosphere among the other children. There was no true camaraderie in the dormitory, only a collection of solitary struggles existing in parallel. The other boys were just as lost as he was, each one guarding his own private pains and fears. Friendships were fleeting, forged over a shared chore or a whispered complaint about Ashworth, but they were too fragile to survive the constant pressure of self-preservation. Everyone was in survival mode, their emotional resources stretched too thin to have much left over for anyone else. Joaquin understood this. He saw the same guarded look in their eyes that he felt in his own, a quiet acknowledgement that in this place you were ultimately, unequivocally, on your own. The word orphan was more than a label. It was a judgment. It was spoken by Ashworth with a faint curl of his lip, a term that separated them from the children of the town, the ones with families and futures. Joaquin felt this distinction every time a car passed him on the road as he walked back from a farm, the faces inside looking at him with a mixture of pity and disinterest. He was part of an invisible caste, a boy defined by what he lacked. He had no father's name to carry with pride, no mother's home to return to. He was, in the eyes of the world and in his own, a stray, and he feared he would spend the rest of his life searching for a place to belong that didn't exist. This feeling of worthlessness was made painfully concrete one sweltering afternoon. Ashworth was speaking to a potential benefactor, giving a tour of the grounds. He gestured vaguely toward a group of boys, including Joaquin, who were weeding a vegetable garden. Joaquin overheard Ashworth's smooth, practiced voice explaining that these boys, having come from less than nothing, were grateful for the structure and purpose the orphanage provided. He then pointed a little more directly at Joaquin and added with a condescending chuckle that some like this one had no connections at all, making them a clean slate for society. The benefactor nodded sympathetically. For Joaquin, the words landed like stones. He wasn't a boy, he was a blank space, an empty page for someone else to write on. That night, lying on his cot, the weight of those words pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. The dormitory was filled with the familiar sounds of restless sleep, a cough from one corner, a muffled cry from another. He reached under his cot for the photograph, its worn surface a small comfort against his palm. He held it to his chest, the image of his mother a silent testament against Ashworth's pronouncement. He didn't feel like a clean slate. He felt like a book with the first and most important chapters ripped out. He closed his eyes, a familiar ache of loneliness blooming in his chest, having no idea that a simple paper envelope, already making its way through the postal system, was about to change everything. The disruption to this bleak existence arrived on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, not with a crash or a shout, but with the quiet arrival of the mail. Joaquin was on his hands and knees in the main hallway, the rhythmic scrape of his brush against the linoleum floor, a familiar, mind-numbing sound. The air was thick with the acrid scent of industrial wax and the oppressive weight of the Texas heat, which seemed to press down on the very roof of the building. He was tasked with polishing the floors outside Mr. Ashworth's office, a job he hated for its proximity to the man, but preferred for its solitude. It was then that the mail carrier, a man whose face was perpetually flushed from the heat, handed a small stack of envelopes to the director. Among them was one that was different, made of thick, cream-colored paper with a formal, typed address that stood out from the usual bills and circulars. Joaquin paused his work for a fraction of a second, his eyes catching his own name, typed in stark black letters, Joaquin David Salazar. The sight was so unusual that for a moment he thought he was mistaken. No one ever sent him letters. He had no one to receive mail from. A strange, unfamiliar flutter of curiosity stirred in his chest, a feeling so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. Mr. Ashworth shuffled through the stack, his thumb stopping on the heavy envelope. He glanced at the name, and then his eyes flickered over to Joaquin, a look of mild annoyance mixed with contempt crossing his features. Without a word, he turned and walked into his office, the letter held between his thumb and forefinger as if it were something distasteful he was about to discard. The heavy oak door swung shut behind him, but it didn't fully latch, leaving a thin, dark sliver of an opening. For a few moments, Joaquin remained perfectly still, the polishing brush resting on the floor. The only sound was the rhythmic, metallic whir of the oscillating fan inside Ashworth's office, its blades chopping the thick, stagnant air. He should have gone back to work, should have forced his focus back to the endless scuff marks on the linoleum. But he couldn't. His entire being was suddenly attuned to that sliver of darkness, to the muffled sounds coming from within the office. He could hear the soft rustle of paper being unfolded, a low, indistinct murmur as Ashworth read to himself, pushing his bucket of supplies a few feet closer, under the pretense of starting a new section of the floor. He held his breath and listened, compelled by a need he didn't understand to know what a letter addressed to him could possibly say. The director's murmuring grew clearer, punctuated by a derisive snort. Joaquin could now make out distinct words, fragments of sentences that floated out into the hallway. He heard "last will and testament," followed by a name that meant nothing to him, Santiago Salazar. Then came the phrase "sole surviving heir," and the location, Fredericksburg, Texas. The words were like pieces of a puzzle he didn't know he was supposed to be solving. Heir, property. He had no family left, no one to leave him anything. The concepts were so far removed from his reality of thin blankets and watery oatmeal that they felt like they belonged to a different language, a different world. He pictured a grand house, a place of impossible comfort, and for a fleeting, foolish moment, a wild and fragile hope took root in his heart. That hope was extinguished as quickly as it had appeared, crushed by the sound that came next. Mr. Ashworth let out a laugh. It wasn't a sound of amusement, but one of pure, unadulterated scorn, a short, ugly bark that seemed to suck all the warmth from the air. The director's voice followed, no longer a murmur, but a clear, loud declaration, as if he were speaking to an invisible audience in the room. Joaquin heard every single word, and they struck him with the force of a physical blow. "An inheritance," Ashworth mocked, his voice dripping with contempt. "A farmhouse and land. Worthless." There was a pause filled with the sound of rustling paper, likely the photographs Joaquin would later discover. "A ruin," the director spat out. "It's less than nothing, just like your family." The final words were delivered with a cold finality, a judgment passed not just on a piece of property, but on Joaquin's entire lineage. The verbal assault was immediately followed by a series of sounds that sealed its meaning. First, there was the violent, percussive crackle of paper being crushed into a tight ball. It was a sound of absolute dismissal, of something being rendered into trash with a single angry clench of a fist. Then came the slight groan of a wooden chair being pushed back, followed by 2 heavy footsteps on the floorboards. The final sound was a hollow metallic scrape, as Ashworth pulled the wire mesh wastebasket from under his desk, followed by a soft, definitive thud as the crumpled letter and its contents were tossed inside. The evidence of his potential future, the only link to a past he never knew, was now officially garbage, discarded without a second thought by a man who saw him the same way. The tangible proof of his connection to the world had been deemed refuse. Out in the hallway, Joaquin felt the air leave his lungs. He was frozen, his knuckles white where he gripped the wooden handle of the polishing brush. The director's words echoed in his mind, repeating over and over again. "Less than nothing. Just like your family." It was the final, brutal confirmation of the story he had been told his entire life. The story he had secretly feared was true. He was not just an orphan, he was the end of a worthless line, a boy descended from nothing who was destined for nothing. The heat in the hallway suddenly felt suffocating, the smell of the wax nauseating. The possibility of another life, a different story, had been presented, and then snatched away in the space of 60 seconds, leaving behind an emptiness far colder and deeper than anything he had felt before. He knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in his stomach, that there was no point in arguing or pleading. To confront Ashworth would be to invite more scorn, more humiliation. The man had not just dismissed the letter, he had taken pleasure in it, using it as another tool to reinforce Joaquin's place at the bottom of the world. The threat was no longer ambiguous. It wasn't about a future punishment or a potential danger. The threat was the absolute certainty of his present reality continuing forever. It was the clear, unequivocal message that he would remain here, polishing floors and mending fences, until he was old enough to be cast out with nothing to his name and no history to anchor him. The door to a different life had been slammed shut and locked, before he even knew it existed. That night, the oppressive silence of the dormitory was different. It was no longer a void of loneliness, but a canvas upon which Joaquin painted a new reality. The director's words, "less than nothing," echoed not as a verdict but as a challenge. They had been meant to crush him, to solidify his place as a forgotten piece of the world. Instead, they ignited something dormant within him, a spark of defiance that had been smothered for 4 long years. Lying perfectly still on his lumpy mattress, staring up into the impenetrable darkness, he made a decision. It was not a grand, dramatic vow, but a quiet, unshakable settling in his bones. He would not be nothing. He would not be a clean slate for others to write upon. He would go to Fredericksburg. He would find that worthless ruin, that collapsed house with a tree growing through its heart, and he would claim it, because it was his. His mind, once a repository for painful memories, became a workshop for a desperate plan. The first and most critical step was retrieving the letter. He knew, with an instinct he couldn't explain, that the crumpled paper was more than just information. It was proof. It was the only tangible link to a life beyond these grey walls. He lay in his cot for what felt like hours, listening as the orphanage exhaled its last waking breaths. He tracked the familiar sounds, the heavy tread of the night monitor on his rounds, the groan of the plumbing as the last toilet was flushed, the final click of the main hallway light. He catalogued the intervals, the patterns, the pockets of silence between the noises. His entire world narrowed to this single task, this one act of theft that felt more like an act of reclamation. The fear was a cold knot in his stomach, but the resolve was hotter, a burning coal that warmed him from the inside out. When the silence had stretched for a full hour, deep and unbroken, he moved. He slid from his cot with a practiced stealth, learned from years of avoiding unwanted attention. Each movement was deliberate, economical, his bare feet finding the familiar cool spots on the linoleum that didn't creak. The journey down the long, moon-splashed hallway was a terrifying pilgrimage. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every draught of air felt like a warning whisper. The door to Mr. Ashworth's office was unlocked, a testament to the director's arrogance, his certainty that no one would ever dare to cross its threshold. Slipping inside, Joaquin was met with the stale, lingering scent of cigar smoke and polish. The room felt like a predator's den, and he was a mouse scurrying across its floor, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, convinced its sound was loud enough to wake the entire building. Moonlight streamed through the tall window, illuminating the wire mesh wastebasket next to the heavy oak desk. It was a silver beacon in the darkness. He crept toward it, his breath held tight in his chest. Reaching inside, his fingers brushed against the crumpled ball of paper. It felt solid, real, a knot of potential. He carefully pulled it out, along with the 2 glossy photographs that had been discarded with it. He didn't dare unfold the letter completely, but in the faint light he smoothed a corner just enough to see his own name typed in black ink. It was real. It was his. A wave of adrenaline and triumph washed over him, so potent it almost made him dizzy. He had done it. He had taken back the first piece of his own story from the man who had tried to throw it away. Back in the relative safety of his bunk, hidden beneath his one thin blanket, he finally examined his prize. He carefully unfolded the letter, its legalistic words a foreign language that still sang a song of hope. He looked at the photographs. Where Ashworth had seen a worthless ruin, Joaquin saw a sanctuary. The collapsed roof was an opening to the sky. The massive oak tree growing through the floor was not a sign of destruction, but of life, of a stubborn, powerful resilience he now felt blooming in his own chest. This was not the end of a forgotten family line. It was a place to begin a new one. Holding the papers in his hand, he crossed a threshold. He was no longer just a disobedient orphan. He was a fugitive in his own home. There was no going back. The thought did not scare him. It liberated him. The next hour was a blur of silent, purposeful action. He moved with a clarity he had never known. From beneath a loose floorboard, he retrieved his only true possession, the faded photograph of his mother, Marisol. He carefully folded the letter and the new photographs around it, creating a small, precious packet that represented his entire past and his only possible future. Next, he crept to the kitchens. The air was cool and smelled of yeast from the next day's bread. He took a single loaf, a dense, heavy thing that felt like a treasure, and slipped it into a cloth sack he'd made from a discarded pillowcase. He filled an old metal canteen with water from the tap, the quiet rush of the stream the only sound in the cavernous room. Each item he gathered was a declaration of independence, a tool for the impossible journey ahead. His preparations were complete. He stood by his cot for a final moment, looking out over the dormitory. In the dim light he could see the shapes of the other boys, their bodies curled in on themselves as if to ward off invisible blows, even in their sleep. He saw their shared predicament, the quiet desperation that hung in the air. A silent farewell passed through him, not for the place which he hated, but for them. The boys he was leaving behind. He felt a sharp pang of guilt, but it was quickly replaced by a hardening of his purpose. He couldn't save them. For now, he could only save himself. He had to believe that was enough. He thought of the 70 miles that lay between him and Fredericksburg. The distance was immense, a vast and terrifying unknown. The fear of what lay on those roads, of hunger, of being caught, of failing, was a living thing, a cold presence at his side. But then he pictured a lifetime spent under Ashworth's cold gaze, his hands calloused from other men's work, his spirit shrinking with each passing day. He weighed the fear of the unknown against the certainty of that bleak future, and the choice was clear. The memory of his grandmother's voice, teaching him about the stars and the sun, became a small, steady light in the overwhelming darkness of his fear. He would not be nothing. He took one last breath of the stale, recycled air of Corazon de Maria and moved toward the kitchen window, toward the night, toward the only thing in the world that was his. The kitchen window was his Rubicon. Pushing the warped wooden frame upward required a slow, agonizing effort, each millimeter of movement accompanied by a soft, scraping groan that sounded like a scream in the dead silence of 3 in the morning. He held his breath, listening for any sign of discovery, but the only response was the rhythmic ticking of the large clock in the dining hall, each second marking a moment closer to his potential capture or his freedom. He swung one leg over the sill, his bare foot finding the damp, cool grass outside. The air was different here. It smelled of dew and earth, a stark contrast to the sterile, waxed scent of the orphanage. For a moment he hesitated, half in and half out, a boy caught between two worlds. The world of predictable misery behind him, and a world of terrifying uncertainty ahead. Then, with a final silent push, he was through, landing softly on the ground, the cloth sack with his meager provisions clutched tightly in his hand. He was outside. The first wall had been breached. He moved through the manicured grounds of the orphanage like a shadow, keeping to the deep darkness cast by the ancient pecan trees that lined the property. The main building loomed behind him, a dark, sleeping beast with 100 unseen eyes. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat that seemed loud enough to wake the dead. Every rustle of leaves, every distant dog's bark, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. He knew the night monitor made his rounds at unpredictable intervals, his heavy flashlight beam cutting sharp, white swaths through the darkness. Joaquin's path was not a straight line, but a series of desperate, calculated dashes from one pool of shadow to the next, his body low to the ground. He could feel the wet grass soaking the cuffs of his thin trousers, a cold that seeped into his skin, but did nothing to quell the fire of fear burning in his chest. His destination was the tall, wrought-iron fence at the far edge of the property, the final barrier between his prison and the open road. The fence was taller than he remembered, its black spires like skeletal fingers pointing accusingly at the star-dusted sky. There was no gate on this side, only an unbroken line of cold, unforgiving iron. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of his resolve. For a moment, his body refused to move, his mind screaming that it was impossible, that he should turn back before it was too late. But then, the image of Mr. Ashworth's sneering face flashed in his mind, the memory of his contemptuous laugh echoing in his ears. That was the fuel he needed. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of freedom, and began to climb. The iron was cold and slick with dew, offering little purchase for his bare feet. He wedged his toes into the ornate scrollwork, his scraped fingers finding holds where none seemed to exist. He reached the top, carefully swinging his leg over the sharp finials, a tear in his shirt, the only price for his passage. He dropped to the other side, landing with a jarring thud on the dirt shoulder of the road, the sound swallowed by the chirping of crickets. He was free. The first hour of walking was fueled by pure, unadulterated fear. He didn't dare look back, convinced he would see the searching beams of flashlights or hear the sound of his name being called. He walked fast, his stride long and purposeful, his head down, following the faint grey ribbon of a dirt road that branched off the main highway. He had made a critical decision in the darkness of the dormitory. The main roads would be watched. His only hope was the web of forgotten back roads that crisscrossed the Texas hill country, paths that were longer and more difficult, but offered the sanctuary of invisibility. He used the North Star to keep his bearings, a trick his grandmother Elena had taught him on nights they had sat on their small porch a lifetime ago. The Big Dipper was his compass, the moon his only lamp. The world felt immense, the silence broken only by his own ragged breathing and the crunch of his worn shoes on the gravel. As the initial terror began to subside, a different kind of feeling settled over him, a profound and aching loneliness. The darkness was no longer just a shield, it was an endless, suffocating blanket. Out here there were no walls, but there was also nothing else. He was a single, tiny point of movement in a vast, sleeping landscape. The weight of the 70 miles ahead pressed down on him, an almost physical force. He clutched the strap of his sack, the loaf of bread and canteen of water, a pathetic arsenal against the immensity of his task. He thought of the other boys, asleep in their cots, and for a fleeting moment he envied their confinement, the known quantity of their suffering. But the feeling passed. He was walking towards something that was his, a concept so new and fragile he was almost afraid to examine it too closely. He just had to keep moving, putting one foot in front of the other until the sun came up. Dawn broke not with a sudden burst of light, but with a slow, reluctant bleed of grey and purple along the eastern horizon. The change revealed a landscape of rolling hills, dotted with scrubby mesquite and live oaks, their gnarled branches reaching like arthritic arms. The beauty of it was lost on him. The light was an enemy. Daylight meant visibility. It meant the risk of being seen by a passing truck or a worker heading to the fields. He found a shallow, dry ditch overgrown with tall grass and slid into it, the scratchy blades cold and wet against his face. He lay there, perfectly still, as the world awoke. He heard the distant lowing of cattle and the rumble of the first vehicle on the nearby highway. He pulled the loaf of bread from his sack and tore off a small piece, chewing it slowly, making it last. The bread was already stale, but it tasted like the most delicious meal he had ever eaten. It tasted of survival. The Texas sun climbed the sky with a brutal, relentless efficiency, transforming the cool morning into a sweltering furnace. The heat radiated up from the baked earth, shimmering in waves that distorted the horizon. He abandoned the open road, choosing instead to walk along the tangled fence lines, using the sparse shade of cedar posts as momentary respites. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes and plastering his thin shirt to his back. His canteen, which had felt so heavy just hours before, now seemed terrifyingly light. He rationed the water, allowing himself only small, unsatisfying sips that seemed to evaporate the moment they touched his tongue. The physical toll of the journey was beginning to make itself known. A blister was forming on his left heel, a hot, insistent point of pain with every step. His muscles, unaccustomed to this relentless pace, began to ache with a deep, burning fatigue. By midday, the world had become a blur of shimmering heat and a constant internal negotiation with pain. He moved in a trance-like state, his focus narrowed to the simple mechanical act of walking. The image of the farmhouse, of the great oak tree growing through its center, was a flickering candle in the storm of his exhaustion. It was the only thing that kept him from simply collapsing under the shade of a mesquite tree and giving up. Late in the afternoon, as he was stumbling through a thicket of brush to avoid a passing car, his foot caught on a root. He fell hard, the impact jarring his teeth and sending his canteen flying from his grasp. It landed with a dull, metallic thud several feet away. For a moment he just lay there, the dusty ground hot against his cheek, the will to get up completely gone. It would be so easy to stop, so easy to just let the world reclaim him. But then his hand, outstretched in the fall, brushed against the small hard packet in his pocket. The letter, the photographs, his mother's face. It was a jolt, a physical reminder of his purpose. He pushed himself up, his knees and elbows scraped raw. He retrieved the canteen, relieved to find it dented but not broken. The incident, small as it was, hardened something inside him. This journey was not just a flight from the orphanage, it was a pilgrimage. He was walking toward the only proof he had that his family was not, as Ashworth had declared, less than nothing. He took another small sip of warm, metallic-tasting water and kept going, his limp more pronounced now, his determination more fragile but somehow stronger for having been tested. He had faced the urge to quit, and had, for now, won. The second day was a crucible. The last of his bread was gone by morning, leaving him with a hollow, gnawing hunger that was a constant companion to his thirst and exhaustion. The blister on his heel had broken, and every step was a fresh, sharp agony. He began to see the landscape not as an obstacle, but as a potential larder, his mind sifting through the lessons Elena had taught him so many years ago. He recognized the rough, dark green leaves of the dewberry bushes, their small, sweet fruits a burst of life on his parched tongue. He found a stand of pecan trees and used a rock to crack open the fallen nuts, their rich, oily meat a meager but vital source of energy. These small acts of survival, of using the knowledge that was his private inheritance, felt like small victories against the overwhelming odds. He was not just a runaway, he was a survivor, living off the land his grandmother had taught him to understand. That night he found shelter in a dry creek bed, the sandy earth still holding a remnant of the day's warmth. He curled into a tight ball, shivering as the temperature dropped, the thin blanket of the night sky offering no comfort. Sleep was fitful, a series of short, dream-haunted dives into unconsciousness, from which he would awake with a start, disoriented and convinced he could hear Ashworth's voice calling his name. In the deepest, coldest hour before dawn, he pulled out the photograph of his mother. In the faint starlight, her smile seemed to offer a silent encouragement. He whispered her name, Marisol, into the darkness, the sound grounding him, reminding him that he was the son of this woman, the grandson of Elena, the heir to a story he was only just beginning to uncover. He was not alone, not truly. He was carrying them with him. The third day dawned with a sense of finality. His body was a symphony of pain, each muscle and joint protesting the continued abuse. His hunger was a dull, constant ache in his stomach, and his thirst was a rasping dryness in his throat. But his mind was clear, sharpened by desperation. He no longer hid from every car, a kind of reckless fatigue having set in. He walked steadily along the side of the road, a small dusty figure moving through a vast, indifferent landscape. His world had shrunk to the next step, and the one after that. He thought of nothing but the house, the tree, the possibility of an answer to the question that had haunted his entire life. Who am I? The name of the town, Fredericksburg, had become a mantra, a prayer he repeated with each painful footfall. Late in the afternoon, he saw it. Through a gap in the hills he caught a glimpse of a church steeple, a distant, hopeful spike against the pale blue sky. It was a town. So it had to be Fredericksburg. The sight sent a surge of energy through his depleted body, a final reserve of strength he didn't know he possessed. He quickened his pace, ignoring the searing pain in his foot, his eyes fixed on that distant point. He was no longer just wandering, he was arriving. The exhaustion was still there, a heavy cloak on his shoulders, but it was now mingled with a new feeling, one he hadn't experienced in 4 long years, a fragile, terrifying, and beautiful flicker of hope. He was close. He didn't enter the town itself. The legal letter described the property as being on the outskirts, marked by a rusted, collapsed fence and an overgrown dirt track. Following the main road from a distance, he scanned the landscape, his eyes searching for the landmarks mentioned in the dry, legalistic prose. It was nearly dusk when he found it, a line of tilted, rust-colored fence posts, nearly swallowed by a thicket of mesquite and tangled vines. Beyond it, a path, barely visible, led into the dense woods. This was it. This had to be the place. He stood there for a long moment, his journey's end in sight. The 70 miles of dust and fear and pain behind him. He took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of cedar and dry earth, and pushed his way through the overgrown brush toward the ruin that was his inheritance. He pushed through the last of the thorny mesquite branches, the sharp spines tearing at his already tattered shirt, and then he stopped. The world went silent, save for the sound of his own ragged breathing. It was real. The farmhouse stood before him, not as a 2-dimensional image on a glossy photograph, but as a 3-dimensional monument to decay and endurance. It was a skeleton, its wooden ribs exposed to the sky, its windows like hollow eye sockets. Yet it was not an image of defeat. The great Texas live oak, the very thing Mr. Ashworth had mocked, was a breathtaking declaration of life. It erupted from the center of the structure, its massive, gnarled branches reaching for the open sky, a living heart in a broken body. This was not a ruin. It was a sanctuary. He had walked 70 miles of dust and fear, and he was, for the first time in his life, home. Stepping over the rotted threshold was like entering a forgotten church. The air inside was cool and still, carrying the rich, earthy scent of damp soil, decaying wood, and the faint, clean fragrance of the oak leaves. Sunlight poured through the collapsed roof, not as a harsh, interrogating beam, but as a soft, dappled cathedral light that illuminated a thick carpet of moss and fallen leaves on the floorboards. The silence was profound, a stark contrast to the constant noise of the orphanage. Here, the only sounds were the whisper of the wind moving through the oak's high branches and the gentle creak of the house settling around him. He stood in the center of the main room, directly under the canopy of the tree, and felt a sense of peace so complete it was almost painful. He was utterly alone, and for the first time it did not feel like a punishment. The first week was a blur of primal survival. His exhaustion was a physical weight he carried everywhere, but it was now paired with a sense of purpose. He chose a corner of the house where a section of the roof remained miraculously intact, sweeping away the debris with a broken piece of board until he had a small, clean space of his own. This small act of homemaking felt more significant than anything he had ever done. During the day he foraged, his grandmother's lessons guiding him to wild onions and the last of the season's dewberries. He found a small clear spring a quarter-mile away, and the cold, clean water was a luxury beyond measure. He was not a fugitive hiding. He was an inhabitant, learning the rhythms of his land, his body slowly healing from the long journey as his spirit began to mend in the solitude. After 7 days of focusing solely on staying alive, his attention turned irrevocably to the tree. It was the center of his new universe, a silent, powerful guardian. He would sit for hours at its base, his back against the rough bark, tracing the intricate patterns of its massive roots as they buckled and broke through the floorboards. He felt a kinship with it, a shared story of stubborn resilience. The tree had not asked for permission to grow here. It had simply asserted its right to exist, to reach for the sun, breaking through any barrier in its way. He saw his own desperate journey in its slow, powerful growth. He needed to understand it, to know its history, because he felt, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that its history was somehow intertwined with his own. On the 8th day he began to dig. He didn't have a clear plan, only a deep, instinctual need to see what lay beneath. Using a flat, sharp-edged rock he'd found by the spring, he started clearing the earth packed around the base of the trunk. The work was slow and grueling. The soil was dense, compacted over decades, and woven into an impenetrable net of smaller roots. His hands, already calloused, quickly grew raw and blistered. Sweat dripped from his brow, making muddy tracks on his dusty face. He worked with a single-minded intensity, his world shrinking to the small patch of earth in front of him. He wasn't just digging in the dirt. He was digging for an answer, for a connection to the man who had planted this tree, for a story that belonged to him. Hours later, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the room, the rock in his hand struck something with a hard metallic clang. The sound was utterly alien in this place of wood and soil and stone. It was a dead, resonant thud that vibrated up his arm, stopping him instantly. He froze, his hand still resting on the rock, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. It wasn't a rock. He knew the sound of stone on stone. This was different. This was the sound of something man-made, something deliberately placed, something hidden. A current of nervous energy, a mixture of fear and wild, uncontainable hope shot through him. He dropped the rock and began to claw at the dirt with his bare hands, a frantic urgency taking over. The soil was cool and packed tight, but he dug with a strength he didn't know he possessed. Dirt flew behind him as his fingers scrabbled at the earth, scraping against the hard surface. Slowly, a patch of dark, rusted metal began to appear. It was iron, pitted and stained from its long years in the damp ground. He worked faster, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, his mind a blank slate of pure anticipation. He uncovered a corner, then a straight edge. It was a box. A heavy, solid iron box, wedged between two of the oak's thickest roots, held in a protective embrace by the very tree he had come to understand. It had been placed there with intention, a secret entrusted to the earth and guarded by the living wood. Freeing it was a battle. The roots held it fast, a natural vault that refused to give up its treasure. He pushed and pulled, his small body straining against the immense passive strength of the tree. He used a sturdy branch as a lever, wedging it beneath one edge and putting all of his weight into it. The box groaned, shifted, and then, with a final sucking sound as it broke free from the damp earth, it slid from its cradle. It was heavier than he could have imagined, a solid, dense weight that felt ancient and important. He dragged it a few feet away from the hole, his muscles screaming in protest, his entire body trembling with a combination of exhaustion and adrenaline. He knelt on the splintered floorboards, his small body racked with a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion that was more emotional than physical. His hands, scraped raw and caked with dirt, rested on the cold, rusted metal of the iron box. For a long moment he did nothing but stare at it, this impossible object pulled from the roots of his own history. He saw the simple, sturdy lock, long since rusted shut. The long walk, the hunger, the fear, the week of lonely survival. It had all led him to this single point in time, to this silent, waiting container. Everything was about to change. He could feel it. A tremor started in his hands and spread through his entire body, and a pressure built behind his eyes, the first sign of tears he hadn't yet earned the right to shed. He was no longer just an orphan in a forgotten ruin. He was the keeper of a buried truth. The rusted lock on the iron box was no match for the flat rock he had used for digging. Her few sharp, desperate blows, and the mechanism, frozen by decades of damp earth, shattered with a metallic crack that echoed in the silent room. With trembling hands, Joaquin lifted the heavy lid. The hinges groaned in protest, releasing a musty, subterranean smell of old metal and trapped time. He peered inside, and his breath caught in his throat. The first thing he saw was not paper, but the dull, silvery glint of metal. The box was lined with dozens of tightly packed paper rolls, each one heavy and solid. He picked one up, his dirty fingers fumbling with the brittle paper. It tore away to reveal a stack of large, heavy coins, their surfaces bearing the image of a stern-faced eagle. They were silver dollars, more money than he had ever imagined existing in one place, a fortune hidden beneath a tree. For a moment, the sheer weight of the wealth was all he could process. It was a physical, tangible refutation of Mr. Ashworth's pronouncement of worthlessness. But beneath the rolls of coins, there was something else, something that felt infinitely more important. He carefully lifted out the remaining money, stacking the rolls on the dusty floorboards beside him. Hand revealed a collection of items wrapped in what looked like oilcloth. There were bundles of letters, tied with faded twine, the paper yellowed and fragile with age. There was a thick, formal-looking document sealed with a brittle wax stamp, and on top of it all a single thicker envelope, on which was written in a careful, elegant script a single word in Spanish, heredero, heir. He knew that word. It was the word Ashworth had spat with such contempt. It was him. He gently untied the twine from the first bundle of letters. The script was dense and written in Spanish, a language he understood from his grandmother, but could read only with difficulty. But he could make out the names repeated like a prayer on the pages. He saw the name Santiago Salazar, his great-uncle, the man from the legal notice. And then he saw another name, a name he had only ever seen on a formal document in his file at the orphanage, David Salazar, his father. These were letters from a father to his son, written before a war that would take that son's life. He couldn't decipher all the words, but he could feel the emotion radiating from the pages, the pride, the worry, the deep, unshakable bond of family. He was holding a conversation frozen in time, a testament to a love he had been told never existed for him. His hands shook as he picked up the single envelope marked Heredero. This letter was different. The Spanish was simpler, the sentences shorter, as if written with the deliberate intention of being understood by a future generation. It was from Santiago. It was written for him. The letter began by explaining the tree. Santiago had planted the small oak sapling in the very center of the living room on the day his son David was born. It was to be a symbol, a living monument to their family's roots in this Texas soil, a reminder that they were not temporary, that they belonged to this land and it belonged to them. He wrote of how he watched the sapling grow, knowing it would one day be a mighty thing, a guardian for the family's future, a protector of its legacy. The letter then took a darker turn, and Joaquin felt a cold dread mix with his sense of wonder. Santiago wrote of his failing health and of his growing fear of a neighbor, a wealthy and powerful man named Raymond Keller. He described Keller as a man with a greedy heart who coveted the Salazar land, 200 acres of the best pasture and clearest springs in the hill country. Santiago suspected the man would not hesitate to use deceit or fraud to steal what was not his once Santiago was gone. He explained that he could not trust the banks nor the local authorities, who were too often in the pockets of men like Keller, and so he devised a plan. He would create a vault that no thief could ever break, a safe that would grow stronger with each passing year, protected by the very symbol of their family's strength. Joaquin paused, rereading the last paragraph, the words blurring through the film of tears that had begun to form in his eyes. He looked from the letter to the hole in the floor, to the massive, intertwined roots of the great oak. He now understood. The box had not been buried and forgotten, it had been entrusted to the tree. Santiago had placed his family's entire future, its history, its wealth, its legal claim to the land, into this iron box and laid it in a cradle of young roots, knowing that the tree would grow around it, enveloping it, guarding it with its immense living strength. He had created a natural vault, a secret kept by the earth itself, waiting for the one person who would have the right to find it. It was an act of incredible foresight, a desperate, brilliant plan to protect his legacy from the greed of the world. He then picked up the formal document. Even without understanding the legal language, he could see the official seals, the date, 1932, and the clear, unambiguous description of the property. He traced the words with his finger. 200 acres. Not a worthless ruin, but a vast and valuable piece of land. It was the original deed and the last will of Santiago Salazar, a document that predated any forgery, any lie that men like Keller could invent. It was the undeniable legal truth, the story he had been told his entire life, that he was the descendant of penniless, insignificant people, was a lie. His family had not been nothing. They had been victims. They had been robbed. And in his hands he held the proof. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place as he read the last lines of Santiago's letter. His great-uncle explained that the neighbor, Keller, had indeed stolen the land after his death, using forged papers and leaving the family with nothing but the old farmhouse itself, which Keller considered worthless. The family line had struggled, eventually scattering, his own father leaving for the war from which he would never return. Joaquin was not the heir to nothing. He was the rightful heir to a 4-generation legacy that had been stolen from his family. The weight of this revelation was staggering. It recontextualized everything he thought he knew about himself. His poverty, his loneliness, his status as an orphan, none of it was an accident of fate. It was the result of a profound and cruel injustice. It was then that the sobs began. They came from a place deep inside him, a place that had been silent and frozen for 4 long years. He knelt on the splintered floorboards, the letters and the deed spread out before him, and he wept. But these were not the hollow, desperate tears of a lonely boy in an orphanage. These were tears of vindication, of grief for a family he never knew, and for the life that had been stolen from them. They were tears of an overwhelming, crushing gratitude for a man he had never met, a great uncle who had looked into the future, seen the possibility of a boy just like him, and built him a sanctuary of wood and iron and earth. He was not an accident, he was not a leftover, he was the heir. He cried for the weight of the lie he had carried, the shame of believing he was worthless, a belief hammered into him by Mr. Ashworth's cold voice and colder eyes. He cried for his father, David, who never got to inherit this legacy, and for his grandmother, Elena, who must have lived her life under the shadow of this great theft. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the faded photograph of his mother, Marisol, and placed it gently amongst the documents. He was their son, their grandson, their continuation. The money, the land, the house, they were all secondary. The true inheritance was this story, this proof that he belonged to a line of proud, resilient people who had been wronged but had never truly been broken. The tears washed away the grime of the journey and the deeper stain of his own perceived worthlessness. He was no longer just Joaquin, the orphan. He was Joaquin David Salazar, the keeper of a buried truth, the inheritor of a legacy guarded by a tree. He pressed his forehead to the cool, dusty floorboards of his home and let the full force of the cataclysmic shift wash over him. The world had not forgotten him. It had simply been waiting for him to come and claim his place within it. He was not alone. He had never been alone. Santiago had been waiting here for him all along, his love and foresight a silent presence in the heart of the great oak. The revelation settled into a quiet, unshakable certainty. He carefully gathered the documents, the letters, and the photograph of his mother, wrapping them back in the oilcloth. He placed them back in the iron box alongside the rolls of silver dollars. The box was no longer just a container, it was an ark. It held the entire history and future of his family. He closed the heavy lid, the sound a soft, definitive thud in the quiet room. He knew what he had to do next. The fear of the outside world, of authority figures, was gone, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. Santiago's letter had mentioned one other name, not with fear but with respect. William Caldwell, a young lawyer at the time, described as an honest man who believed in justice. Joaquin's next journey would not be one of escape, but of reclamation. He spent one more night in the farmhouse, but it was different. He was no longer a squatter but a guardian. He slept near the base of the great oak, his hand resting on the iron box, and for the first time in his memory, his sleep was deep and dreamless. He was anchored. He had roots. The next morning, he walked into the town of Fredericksburg, not as a dusty, frightened runaway, but as a boy with a purpose. He asked for directions to the office of Judge William Caldwell, a name that, he was relieved to find, was still known and respected in the town. He was walking not to ask for charity, but to demand justice, armed with a truth that had been buried for nearly half a century. His meeting with the now-retired Judge Caldwell was the turning point. The old judge, a man with kind eyes and a keen, intelligent face, listened to Joaquin's story with growing intensity. When Joaquin finally opened the iron box and laid out the contents on the judge's heavy mahogany desk, the original 1932 will, the deed, the letters from Santiago, the judge fell silent. He examined the documents with a practiced eye, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock, and then to a slow-burning, righteous anger. He recognized the name Raymond Keller, a man whose family had built an empire on lands of questionable origin. He knew, with the certainty of a man who had fought these battles his entire life, that he was looking at the truth. The discovery of the original will triggered a legal firestorm. The federal investigation that followed unearthed a pattern of fraud and land theft orchestrated by the Keller family that spanned decades. It turned out that Santiago Salazar had been Keller's first victim, but not his last. 7 other local Mexican-American families had been systematically cheated out of their ancestral lands through forged documents and legal intimidation. Joaquin's personal quest for his inheritance became a fight for the restoration of justice for an entire community. The iron box, guarded by the oak tree, held the key that unlocked not just his own future, but the stolen pasts of many others. Over 1,000 acres of land were rightfully returned to their heirs. Joaquin's 200 acres were fully restored, and the silver coins provided more than enough to begin the careful, loving restoration of the farmhouse. He never returned to the Corazon de Maria orphanage. Instead, he found a new family with Judge Caldwell and his wife Rosa, a teacher who took it upon herself to educate Joaquin not just in books, but in the rich history of his own ancestors. They formally adopted him, giving him the stable, loving home he had never known. The house was meticulously rebuilt around the great oak, its living branches now stretching through a custom-built atrium, a constant, breathtaking reminder of the roots that had saved him. It was no longer a ruin, but a home, a living monument to his family's resilience and a grandfather's undying hope. He grew up on that land, learning its rhythms, feeling the deep connection Santiago had written about all those years ago. He raised his own family in that house, his children playing under the protective canopy of the same great oak. He made sure they knew the whole story, the story of Santiago's foresight, of David's sacrifice, of Marisol's love, and of the long, dusty road that had brought him home. He taught them that true inheritance is not measured in acres or in dollars, but in the strength of a story, in the courage to reclaim what was stolen, and in the deep, unshakable power of roots that refuse to die, no matter how long they have been buried.